The last customer had left 40 minutes ago, but the smell of him lingered, cheap cologne and cheaper intentions, the kind of man who believed a 20% tip entitled him to a waitress's phone number. Elena Morrow wiped the table where he had sat, her cloth moving in precise, circular motions that erased not just the ring stains, but the memory of his hand brushing hers when she set down the check. La Fontana was quiet now, the kind of quiet that only descended on a restaurant after 11 on a Tuesday night, when the kitchen had exhaled its last cloud of garlic-infused steam and the dishwasher's rhythmic churning became the only heartbeat left in the building. The dining room held 32 tables, each dressed in white linen that glowed faintly amber under the dimmed pendant lights, and Elena moved between them with the efficiency of someone who had memorized the geometry of the space so thoroughly that she could navigate it blindfolded. She did not shuffle. She did not drag her feet. Every step was deliberate, every gesture economical, as though she had been trained to conserve energy the way a long-distance swimmer conserves oxygen, not out of laziness, but out of an understanding that endurance required discipline, and discipline began with the smallest movements. Her uniform was the standard La Fontana issue, black slacks, white button-down, a half apron cinched at the waist. On her, it looked like something else entirely. Not because it fit her particularly well, but because she wore it the way a soldier wears fatigues, without vanity, without complaint, as a fact of her current existence, rather than a statement about her identity. Her dark hair was pulled back in a knot so tight it seemed to sharpen the angles of her face, and her hands, which were slender and strong, moved with a surgeon's awareness of their own capabilities. Marco, the owner, watched her from behind the bar where he was polishing glasses that were already clean. He had hired her 8 months ago, when she walked in off the street with no resume, no references, and no explanation for why a woman who carried herself like that wanted to bus tables for $13 an hour plus tips. He had almost turned her away. Then she had looked at his wine list, pointed to 3 bottles that were stored at the wrong temperature, identified a 4th that had been corked before it was opened, and quoted the vintage year of his most expensive Barolo, without glancing at the label. He hired her on the spot. In 8 months, she had never been late, never called in sick, never complained, and never once accepted an invitation from any of the men, and there were many who tried to take her to dinner. She worked. She cleaned. She disappeared. The sound came first. Not the engines. Those were engineered to be quiet. The kind of quiet that cost more than most people's annual salary. But the tires. 3 sets of them, rolling across the gravel lot outside La Fontana with the synchronized precision of a military convoy. Elena heard them before she saw the headlights sweep across the front windows, painting the linen tablecloths in a momentary wash of cold white. She did not stop wiping the table. She did not look up. But her hand slowed, almost imperceptibly, the way a deer's ear rotates toward a sound before the rest of its body decides whether to run. Marco heard them too. His polishing cloth went still against the glass. Through the front window, 3 black Cadillac Escalades pulled into the lot and arranged themselves in a formation that was not accidental. 2 flanking, 1 centered directly before the entrance, their grills aimed at the front door like the barrels of cannons. The engines died in sequence. Left, right, center. A silence followed that was different from the restaurant's natural quiet. This was a silence with weight, with intention. The front door opened and 2 men entered first. They were not large in the way of bodybuilders or bouncers. They were large in the way of structures, load-bearing, functional, built for a purpose that had nothing to do with aesthetics. Their suits were dark, their shirts were darker, and their eyes moved across the room with the mechanical thoroughness of surveillance cameras completing a sweep. One checked the kitchen entrance, the other checked the restroom corridor. Neither spoke. Neither needed to. They communicated in the language of men who had rehearsed this protocol so many times it had become autonomic, like breathing. Then the 3rd man entered. The room changed. It was not a dramatic change, no thunder, no crash, no visible alteration in the physical space, but Elena felt it the way she might feel a shift in barometric pressure before a storm. a tightening in the air, a subtle increase in the gravity of every object in the room, as though the building itself had recognized the presence of someone who operated on a different plane of consequence. He was not the tallest man she had ever seen. He was not the broadest. But he occupied space with an authority that had nothing to do with physical dimensions. He stood perhaps 6'1", lean beneath a charcoal suit that had been cut by someone who understood that true power did not announce itself through flash, but through fit. The jacket sat on his shoulders, like it had been poured there. His shirt was white, open at the collar, no tie, and the absence of that single accessory communicated more than any silk knot ever could. This was a man who did not perform for anyone's expectations. His face was the face of a man in his late 30s, who had lived the years of someone twice that age. Dark eyes set beneath brows that formed a straight, uncompromising line. A jaw that looked like it had been designed by someone who understood that bone structure was architecture. Hair black and swept back, not styled, but managed, controlled the way everything about him was controlled. He did not scan the room the way his men had. He did not need to. He walked to the corner table, the one furthest from the windows, back against the wall, sightlines to both the entrance and the kitchen corridor, and sat down. His men positioned themselves without instruction, one at the adjacent table, one near the door. A fourth man, who had entered so quietly that Elena had not registered his arrival, materialized at the bar and ordered water with a stillness that suggested even hydration was a tactical decision. Marco's face had gone the color of the linen. He set down his polishing cloth and walked toward Elena with the careful gait of a man crossing a frozen lake. She felt him approach before he spoke. His voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper, and it carried the specific tremor of a man who understood exactly who had just walked into his restaurant. "That is Dominic Ferraro," Marco said, and the name landed between them like a stone dropped into still water. Elena watched the ripples move through Marco's body, the tightening of his shoulders, the way his fingers interlaced and then released, the micro-adjustment of his posture that was not quite a straightening and not quite a shrinking, but something in between, the posture of a man trying to make himself simultaneously presentable and invisible. She had heard the name before. Everyone in this city had heard the name before. It appeared in newspaper headlines the way a fault line appears on geological maps. Present, dangerous, understood by everyone to be capable of reshaping the landscape at any moment, yet somehow accepted as a permanent feature of the terrain. The Ferraro family had operated in this city for 3 generations, their influence threading through construction, shipping, real estate, and a dozen other industries with the quiet persistence of roots growing beneath a sidewalk, invisible until the concrete cracked. Dominic was the youngest son who had become the only son after circumstances that the newspapers described in careful, lawsuit-proof language, and that the streets described with no language at all, only silence and the quick change of subject that accompanied any mention of what had happened to his older brother. He had assumed control of the family's operations 4 years ago, and in that time he had done something that his father and grandfather had never managed. He had become invisible. Not invisible in the way of a man who hides, but invisible in the way of a man who no longer needs to be seen to be felt. His name did not appear in indictments. His photograph did not appear in surveillance dossiers. He existed in the space between evidence and implication, between fact and fear, and it was in that space that his real power resided. Marco wanted Elena to take his table. She could see the calculus behind his eyes, the hope that her composure, her professionalism, her strange, unshakable calm would prevent the kind of stumbling, sweating, plate-dropping service that would come from any of the other staff, all of whom had already retreated to the kitchen with the instinctive self-preservation of prey animals sensing the arrival of an apex predator. Elena nodded once. She picked up a leather-bound menu, a wine list, and a water carafe. She walked toward the corner table. She set the water down first. The glass made no sound against the tablecloth, because she placed it exactly where it needed to be. 2 inches from the right edge of the place setting, aligned with the lower rim of the bread plate, at a distance that allowed for a natural reach without requiring the guest to extend his arm beyond the boundary of comfort. It was a detail so small that most people would never notice it. Dominic Ferraro noticed it. She saw his eyes track the placement with the same precision she had used to execute it, and she understood immediately that this was a man who catalogued details the way other men collected possessions, compulsively, instinctively, because the difference between a detail noticed and a detail missed was, in his world, the difference between breathing and not breathing. She set the menu before him. "Good evening," she said. Her voice was level, not warm, not cold. Professional in a way that carried no performance, no affected friendliness, none of the sing-song cadence that the restaurant industry trained into its servers, the way circuses trained smiles into their performers. She sounded like exactly what she was, a person doing her job with competence and without apology. He did not open the menu. He looked at her for a duration that most people would have found uncomfortable, 3 seconds, 4, 5, with eyes that were not hostile, but were absolutely, uncompromisingly assessing. She held his gaze. She did not smile. She did not look away. She did not fidget with her order pad or shift her weight from one foot to the other. She simply stood, present and unadorned, and waited. He spoke. His voice was lower than she had expected, with a texture that reminded her of something she could not immediately place, gravel smoothed by water, perhaps, or the sound of heavy fabric being drawn across a wooden surface. "The Barolo," he said. "The 2015. She did not write it down. "The 2015 is excellent," she said. "But if you are eating the osso buco, which is what your kitchen is still capable of producing at this hour, the 2012 is the better pairing. It has another 3 years of tannin resolution, and the acidity will cut the marrow richness without competing with it." The silence that followed was architectural. It had walls, a ceiling, a weight that pressed against the skin. One of his men at the adjacent table turned his head slowly, the way a turret rotates. Marco, somewhere behind the bar, stopped breathing. Dominic Ferraro looked at Elena Morrow with an expression that was not anger, not amusement, but something rarer. Genuine interest. He held her gaze for another 2 seconds, then inclined his head by a degree so slight it might have been a twitch, might have been a nod, might have been the first gesture of respect he had offered a stranger in years. "The 2012, he said, "and the ossobuco." She turned and walked toward the kitchen. Her steps were even. Her breathing was steady. She did not allow herself to feel anything about what had just happened, because feeling was a luxury that required safety, and safety was something she had stopped expecting a long time ago. The meal lasted 90 minutes. During that time, Elena served 4 courses, the osso buco preceded by a bresaola with shaved parmigiano, followed by a simple arugula salad dressed with lemon and olive oil, and finished with an espresso so dark it seemed to absorb light. She poured the Barolo at the precise temperature Marco kept it, which was 4 degrees too warm, but she said nothing about this, because she had already corrected one choice tonight, and understood that correction, like ammunition, was most effective when used sparingly. Dominic ate alone. His men did not eat. They sat at their posts like sentinels carved from stone, their water glasses untouched, their hands resting on the table or in their laps, in positions that were not casual, but were designed to provide the fastest possible access to whatever was concealed beneath their jackets. The restaurant remained empty. No other customers arrived, and Elena suspected this was not coincidence. Word traveled in certain circles faster than light, faster, certainly, than the speed at which a hungry couple might decide on a Tuesday night dinner, and the 3 black SUVs parked outside La Fontana broadcast a message that required no translation. "This space is occupied. Come back tomorrow." She cleared each course with the same precision with which she had set the first glass of water. She did not hover. She did not check in with the bright, intrusive frequency that corporate restaurant training demanded. She appeared when a plate was finished, removed it without comment, and delivered the next course at intervals that matched the natural rhythm of his eating, which she had calibrated within the first 10 minutes by observing the speed at which he cut his meat, the duration between sips of wine, the moment when his hand moved from the table to his lap. the unconscious signal that a man was finished with a course but had not yet decided to acknowledge it. When the espresso was done, she brought the check. It was not a large bill. The Barolo was the most expensive item, and even that was modest by the standards of what this man could afford. She placed the leather folio at the edge of the table and retreated. He opened it. He set a credit card on top. Then, with a movement so casual it might have been an afterthought, he reached into his jacket, withdrew an envelope, and placed it on the table beside the folio. The envelope was not sealed. Its flap was tucked in, the way a man tucks a handkerchief into a breast pocket, an arrangement that suggested both carelessness and intention, a thing done without effort, but not without thought. Inside, visible through the open flap, was cash. $100 bills stacked with the mechanical neatness of bills that had passed through a counting machine. Elena processed his credit card, returned it, thanked him for dining with them, and then looked at the envelope. She knew what it was before she counted it. She knew because the thickness of a stack of $100 bills is a physical fact that the human hand can estimate with surprising accuracy, and she estimated this stack at approximately 100 bills. $10,000. She picked up the envelope. She walked to his table. He was already standing. His jacket was buttoned, a single button, the correct button. The button that men of his world fastened not for warmth, but as a signal that the evening was complete, that the transition from seated to vertical was also a transition from available to departing. His men had risen simultaneously, their chairs pushed back in unison with the choreographed precision of dancers performing a move they had rehearsed 10,000 times. Elena stopped 2 feet from him. The distance was intentional, close enough to extend her arm, far enough to maintain the boundary between service and supplication. She held out the envelope. She did not extend it aggressively, the way a person might thrust an unwanted object back at its owner. She held it at the midpoint between them, balanced on her palm, the way one might hold something fragile that one wished to return undamaged. "I cannot accept this," she said. 4 words. No explanation. No apology. No self-deprecating smile or awkward laugh or stream of justifications about restaurant policy or personal principles. Just the statement, delivered with the same level professionalism with which she had recommended the 2012 Barolo. The effect was immediate and total. The man nearest the door shifted his weight forward by half an inch, a movement so subtle that only someone trained to read bodies would have recognized it as the preparatory phase of intervention. The man at the adjacent table turned his head fully toward Elena for the first time all evening, and his expression, which had been a mask of professional blankness, cracked momentarily into something that looked like disbelief. Marco, behind the bar, gripped the edge of the counter so hard that his knuckles turned the color of the linen. Dominic Ferraro looked at the envelope on her palm. Then he looked at her face. His expression did not change. There was no flicker of anger, no flash of wounded pride, no tightening of the jaw that would indicate offense. His eyes simply rested on hers with the same assessing steadiness he had shown when she first approached his table, but there was something different in them now. A depth of attention that suggested he was no longer evaluating what she was, but trying to understand who she was, and that the distinction between those 2 questions was, for him, profound. The moment lasted 5 seconds. In those 5 seconds, the air in La Fontana became something you could almost touch. Dense, pressurized, vibrating at a frequency that Elena felt in her sternum. Then he did something none of his men expected. He smiled. It was not a broad smile, not a warm smile. It was the smile of a man encountering a species he had believed extinct. A smile of recognition, of surprise, of something that existed in the narrow territory between admiration and curiosity. He reached out and, with one finger, pushed the envelope back toward her, not onto her palm but against her wrist, so that the gesture was less a return and more a gentle insistence. She did not move. The envelope remained balanced between his finger and her wrist, a $10,000 bridge connecting 2 people who had absolutely no reason to be connected. She shook her head. One movement, left to right. It was not a gesture of defiance. It was a boundary, drawn with the quiet finality of a line scored into stone. He withdrew his finger. He studied her for one more second, a second in which Elena felt the full weight of his attention land on her like sunlight focused through a lens, hot and concentrated and impossible to ignore. Then he turned and walked toward the door. His men fell into formation around him without a word, without a signal, moving on instinct the way planets move in orbit, held in place by a gravity they do not question and cannot resist. The door closed behind them. The engines started. The headlights swept the windows one final time, and then the 3 black SUVs pulled out of the lot and disappeared into the night with the smooth, silent inevitability of a tide retreating from shore. Elena stood in the empty restaurant for a full minute after the sound of the engines faded. The envelope was still in her hand. She had not put it down. She had not returned it to the table or slipped it into her apron or set it on the bar. She held it the way a person holds a thing they have not yet decided how to categorize, not with grip, but with awareness, the way you hold a live thing that might move. Marco appeared beside her. His face was a geology of conflicting emotions, relief that it was over, terror at what it might mean, and beneath both of those, a bewilderment so naked it made him look 10 years older. He opened his mouth to speak and then closed it again, because what do you say to a waitress who just handed back a $10,000 tip from Dominic Ferraro? What words exist in any language for that particular act of insanity? Elena set the envelope on the nearest table, untied her apron, folded it with the same precision she applied to everything, and placed it on the bar. She collected her jacket from the hook by the kitchen door, a thin canvas thing that was not warm enough for the night air, but was the only jacket she owned. "Good night, Marco," she said, and she walked out. The walk home took 14 minutes. She had timed it once, the first week, the way she timed everything, not out of obsession, but out of a need to know the dimensions of her world, to map its boundaries so that she could move within them without surprise. Her apartment was 6 blocks east of La Fontana, on the 2nd floor of a building that had once been a garment factory and had been converted into residential units with the minimum investment required by code and the maximum disregard for aesthetics permitted by law. The stairwell smelled of pine disinfectant and something older, mustier, embedded in the concrete itself. Decades of human habitation compressed into a scent that was not unpleasant, but was inescapable, the olfactory equivalent of a watermark. Her apartment was a studio. 1 room, 1 window, 1 closet, 1 bathroom barely large enough to stand in. The bed was made with military corners. The kitchen counter held a single coffee mug, a French press, and a bag of beans from a roaster 3 neighborhoods away that she could not really afford, but refused to give up because there were concessions to poverty, and then there were surrenders, and she had learned to distinguish between the two with surgical precision. She hung her jacket on the hook behind the door. She removed her shoes and placed them side by side beneath the bed. She stood at the window for a moment, looking out at the street below, empty, orange under the sodium lights, the asphalt still wet from an afternoon rain that had come and gone while she was working. Then she turned to the closet. It was a small closet, barely 4 feet across, with a single shelf above a hanging rod that held 3 white shirts, 2 pairs of black slacks, and a dress she had not worn in 2 years. On the shelf, behind a folded blanket, was a box. It was a banker's box, the kind sold at office supply stores, white cardboard with a lid that fit snugly and a label space on the front that she had left blank. She did not open it tonight. She rarely opened it. But she stood before the closet and looked at the blank label space, and for a moment her composure, the composure that had held through the arrival of Dominic Ferraro, through the wine correction, through the refusal of $10,000, cracked, not visibly. Not in any way that a camera would catch. But something shifted behind her eyes. A tectonic movement in the deep architecture of her self-control. And she pressed her lips together in a line so thin it might have been drawn with a blade. She closed the closet. She washed her face. She went to bed. She did not sleep for a long time. 14 blocks west and 23 stories up, In a penthouse that occupied the entire top floor of a building he owned, Dominic Ferraro sat in a leather chair and did not sleep either. He was not thinking about the Osso Buco, which had been adequate. He was not thinking about the Barolo, which had been better than adequate, and which he had finished alone in the back of the Escalade, while his driver navigated the city's empty late-night streets with the cautious precision of a man who understood that the cargo he carried was irreplaceable. He was thinking about the waitress. Specifically, he was thinking about her eyes. Not their color, brown, unremarkable, but their depth. The way they had met his without flinching, without performing bravery, without the desperate twitching courage of someone who is terrified, but determined not to show it. There had been no terror in those eyes. There had been something else. Something he recognized because he saw it every morning in his own mirror. The absolute, bone-deep stillness of a person who has already lost everything they were afraid of losing. He reached for his phone. He pressed a single contact. The voice that answered did not say hello. It said one word, "Boss. Find out who she is," Dominic said. "Everything." And the line went dead. The morning came gray and reluctant, the kind of morning that felt like the sky itself was debating whether to commit to the day. Elena ran 4 miles before dawn, a route she had mapped along the waterfront, where the industrial district met the river, past shuttered warehouses and sleeping cranes, and the skeletal frames of buildings that were either being born or dying. It was impossible to tell which in the half-light. She ran the way she did everything, with discipline, with economy, with a rhythm so steady that her footfalls sounded like a metronome set to a tempo that never varied. The run was not for fitness, though she was fit. It was for maintenance. It was the daily ritual by which she kept the machinery of her body calibrated, the way a watchmaker winds a mechanism, not because it has stopped, but because precision requires constant, invisible attention. She showered in water that the building's ancient plumbing delivered at a temperature approximately 8 degrees below comfortable. She dressed. She made coffee. She drank it standing at the window, watching the street below, and at 7:42 she saw them. 3 black Cadillac Escalades, parked in a row along the curb directly across from her building, their darkened windows reflecting the gray morning light like the faceted eyes of enormous insects. They had not been there when she left for her run. They were here now. Elena took another sip of coffee. The mug was warm in her hands, and she held it with both palms wrapped around the ceramic. Not for warmth, but because the solidity of it, the weight, the texture, the specific temperature conducted through the clay, was an anchor, a physical fact she could hold while she processed what the 3 vehicles meant. She finished her coffee. She rinsed the mug. She placed it upside down on the drying rack beside the sink. She picked up her jacket, walked down the stairs, stepped outside, and walked directly past the 3 SUVs, without altering her pace by a single step. La Fontana did not open for lunch until 11:30, but Elena arrived at 10 to help with prep, as she always did, slicing lemons into precise wedges and rolling silverware into napkin bundles with the mechanical fluency of a card dealer shuffling a deck. The restaurant was quiet. The morning staff consisted of herself, the prep cook Ernesto, and the busboy, a 19-year-old named Danny who was studying engineering at the community college, and who treated every shift at La Fontana as an interruption to his real life, rather than a component of it. At 10:15 the front door opened, and a man walked in. He was not Dominic Ferraro. He was one of the men from the night before, the one who had positioned himself at the adjacent table, the one whose expression had cracked into disbelief when Elena returned the envelope. In the morning light, stripped of the restaurant's amber glow and the ceremonial context of the previous evening, he looked ordinary. Medium height, medium build, a face that was designed by genetics to be forgettable and maintained by profession to stay that way. He wore a dark blue suit that was good but not exceptional, and he moved with the measured confidence of a man who was accustomed to entering spaces and obtaining what he needed from them without resistance. He approached Marco, who had emerged from his office with the expression of a man who had been expecting this visit the way a patient expects a diagnosis, with dread, with resignation, and with the faint, irrational hope that it might somehow be less terrible than feared. Elena watched from the prep station. She could not hear the conversation, but she could read its architecture in Marco's body. The initial stiffening, the gradual loosening as questions were asked that were apparently not threatening, the nervous hand movements that accompanied answers he was uncertain about, and finally the slow, confused nod of a man who has been told something he does not understand, but has decided not to challenge. The man in the blue suit stayed for 11 minutes. He ordered nothing. He examined nothing. He simply talked to Marco, listened to the answers, and then left through the front door with the same measured stride with which he had entered. Through the window, Elena watched him cross the parking lot and get into the passenger side of a black SUV that she had not noticed when she arrived. The vehicle pulled away. Marco stood behind the bar for a long moment, staring at the spot where the man had stood, and then he walked toward Elena with the careful, apologetic gait of a man delivering news he wished he did not possess. "He asked about you," Marco said. His voice was quiet, almost reverent, the way people speak in hospitals and courtrooms. "Everything. Your full name, where you live, how long you have worked here, whether you have family, whether anyone visits you, whether you have ever mentioned a previous career." Elena set down her paring knife. The blade rested on the cutting board at a perfect perpendicular to the edge of the counter, and she looked at it for a moment. The clean steel, the precise angle, the order she had imposed on this small object in this small space, before she looked at Marco. "What did you tell him?" she asked. "The truth," Marco said. "That your name is Elena Morrow. That you have worked here 8 months. That you are the best server I have ever employed. That you know more about wine than anyone I have ever met. That you never speak about yourself. That I know nothing about your life before you walked into my restaurant." He paused. "And that you are the kind of person," he said, choosing his words with the care of a man handling something fragile, who does not make mistakes without reasons. The banker's box in Elena's closet contained a life. Not the life she was living now. This quiet, compressed existence of 14-minute walks and French press coffee in military corners on a single bed. But the life she had lived before. The life that had been dismantled with the systematic thoroughness of a building being demolished from the inside out. Each load-bearing wall removed in sequence until the structure collapsed into its own footprint with a neatness that almost looked intentional. The box held documents. A law degree from Columbia, summa cum laude, the embossed seal still sharp beneath her fingertips, a certificate of admission to the New York State Bar, a photograph of a man in his 60s standing before a pharmacy with his name on the awning, Morrow Family Pharmacy, established 1971. His face creased with the particular kind of pride that belongs to people who build things with their hands and their names. Her father, Robert Morrow, a pharmacist in a small town in upstate New York who had spent 38 years filling prescriptions, counseling patients, and trusting that the medicines he dispensed were what their labels claimed them to be. He was wrong. The box held the evidence of how wrong he was. Photocopies of internal memos from Ethon Pharmaceuticals, one of the largest generic drug manufacturers in the country, documenting what they called production variants and what the rest of the world would call fraud. Batch records showing that medications distributed under Ethon's label, blood pressure regulators, thyroid supplements, cardiac stabilizers, contained active ingredients at concentrations that deviated from their stated dosages by as much as 40%. Some pills contained nearly nothing. Some contained nearly double. The variance was not random. It was economic. Ethon had discovered that by manipulating concentrations, they could stretch raw materials across more units, reduce production costs by an estimated 11% per quarter, and increase margins on generics that were supposed to compete on price, not on the gamble of whether the pill in your hand would actually do what it promised. Robert Morrow had begun noticing the pattern the way a pharmacist notices patterns, through his patients. Mrs. Garza, whose blood pressure had been stable for 6 years, suddenly spiking. Tom Braddock, whose thyroid levels had gone haywire after decades of consistency. A cluster of cardiac events among elderly patients who had been switched to Ethon generics when their insurance plans changed formularies. He had started keeping records. He had contacted the state pharmacy board. He had written letters to Ethon. He had done everything a decent, principled man does when he discovers that the system he trusts is poisoning the people he serves. The system responded, not with answers, not with investigation, with annihilation. Ethon's legal division, a department that employed more attorneys than Robert Morrow's entire town employed people, filed a defamation suit. They reported him to the state licensing board for dispensing errors he had never committed, using fabricated patient complaints generated by a consulting firm that specialized in reputation destruction. His pharmacy license was suspended pending investigation. His insurance was canceled. His suppliers, contacted by Ethon's procurement team with carefully worded suggestions about liability exposure, stopped filling his orders. Morrow Family Pharmacy closed on a Tuesday afternoon in November. The awning came down the following week. Robert Morrow died 14 months later. The death certificate said cardiac arrest. Elena knew what it really said. It said that a man can survive poverty, can survive injustice, can survive the loss of everything he built, but he cannot survive the knowledge that the thing he trusted to keep people alive was killing them, and that no one with the power to stop it cared enough to try. Elena had been 29 years old when her father died. She had been an assistant federal prosecutor in the Southern District of New York for 3 years, specializing in pharmaceutical fraud and regulatory enforcement. She was good at it, not good in the way that ambitious young attorneys are good, with flash and aggression and a hunger for headlines, but good in the way that her father had been good at pharmacy. Quietly, meticulously, with a devotion to accuracy that made her colleagues uncomfortable because it reminded them of a standard they had stopped trying to meet. She had her father's records. She had his correspondence with Ethon. She had the batch data he had compiled, cross-referenced with patient outcomes, organized in a system so thorough and so precise that, when she presented it to her supervising attorney, he had stared at it for a long time, and then asked her, very carefully, if she understood what she was asking the office to do. She understood. She was asking them to open an investigation into a company that donated to 14 sitting members of Congress, that employed a former FDA commissioner as its chief compliance officer, that retained a law firm whose partners included 2 former attorneys general and a man who had been shortlisted for the Supreme Court. She was asking them to take a fight that could not be won quietly and might not be won at all. They opened the investigation. It lasted 7 months. In those 7 months, Elena built a case with the obsessive, load-bearing precision of an engineer constructing a bridge. Every document verified, every witness corroborated, every chain of custody immaculate. She worked 16-hour days. She lost weight she could not afford to lose. She stopped returning calls from friends, from her sister, from anyone who existed outside the narrowing tunnel of the case, and then, on a Monday morning, her supervising attorney called her into his office and told her the investigation was being closed. "Insufficient evidence," he said, and the words came out of his mouth with the specific flatness of a man reciting a script he has been given by someone he cannot refuse. She looked at him. She saw in his face the same thing she had seen in her father's face in the months before he died. Not fear, exactly, but the particular exhaustion of a person who has discovered that the walls of the maze are not fixed, but are constantly moving, and that no matter how carefully you map the route, someone is always rearranging the corridors behind you. She resigned the next day. She filed a Qui Tam lawsuit under the False Claims Act, using her father's evidence and her own. Ethon's response was not a legal defense. It was an extinction event. Within 6 weeks, Elena Morrow's bar admission was under review for unspecified ethical violations. Her apartment lease was not renewed. Her bank accounts were frozen pending a fraud investigation that materialized from nowhere and dissolved into nothing once its purpose, financial strangulation, had been achieved. The Qui Tam case was dismissed on procedural grounds so obscure that even the judge seemed uncertain of the precedent he was citing. Elena Morrow, summa cum laude, Columbia Law, former federal prosecutor, daughter of Robert Morrow, became Elena Morrow, unemployable, unhouseable, erased. She disappeared. Not dramatically, not with a final stand or a public statement or a righteous interview on the courthouse steps. She simply ceased to exist in the world where she had once operated, and reappeared 8 months later, in a waitress uniform at La Fontana, wiping tables with the same precision she had once used to build federal cases, carrying inside her a box of evidence that no one would ever see, and a loss that no amount of time would metabolize. The second evening, he came alone. Not truly alone. The driver remained in the single black SUV parked at the curb, and Elena suspected there were other men, in other vehicles, distributed at distances and positions she could not identify from inside the restaurant. But to the visible eye, Dominic Ferraro entered La Fontana unaccompanied, wearing a jacket that was darker than the previous night's charcoal, closer to black, the color of deep water under an overcast sky, and sat at the same corner table as though the chair had been holding his shape in his absence. It was 8:15. The restaurant held 6 other occupied tables, all of which had been seated before his arrival, and all of which, Elena noticed, would quietly request their checks within the next 20 minutes, driven by an instinct they probably could not name, but that operated with the efficiency of any survival mechanism. She brought water. She brought a menu. He did not open it. The 2012, he said. She poured it. He swirled the glass once, not the performative, theatrical swirling of a man who has learned about wine from movies, but the single, efficient rotation of someone who understands that the purpose of the gesture is aeration, not display. He tasted it. He set the glass down. Then he looked at her. "You corrected me last night," he said. His voice carried the same low, textured quality she remembered, but there was something lighter in it now, a filament of something that was not quite warmth, but was at least the absence of ice. "You were right." She did not respond to the compliment, because it was not a compliment. It was a statement of fact, and she had learned long ago that responding to facts with gratitude was a form of self-diminishment she could not afford. "Would you like to order?" she asked. He ordered the same meal. She brought it with the same precision. And when she returned to clear his appetizer, he spoke again. "I sent someone to ask about you this morning." The sentence hung in the air between them, and Elena felt its weight the way she felt everything. Not as emotion, but as data. He was not apologizing. He was not explaining. He was informing her, with the directness of a man who considered deception wasteful, that he had investigated her. She set the cleared plate on her tray. She knew. "He knows I know," she thought. This is a conversation about transparency, not about information. "What did you learn?" she asked, because the question was the only honest response to his honesty. "That you are a mystery," he said, "and I do not like mysteries." She almost smiled. It was the closest she had come to smiling in months, not the professional, customer-facing arrangement of features she deployed at La Fontana, but a real smile born from the recognition of a quality she respected, directness. "That is not my problem," she said, and picked up the tray and walked toward the kitchen and felt his eyes on her back like sunlight, warm, focused, impossible to ignore. The parking garage beneath La Fontana was the kind of space that existed in the margins of the city's consciousness, necessary, functional, forgotten. It occupied the building's subterranean level, a concrete cavity that held perhaps 40 vehicles, and smelled of motor oil and damp stone and the faintly metallic tang of a drainage system that had not been maintained since the building changed ownership. The fluorescent lights that lined its low ceiling operated on a timer that was slightly miscalibrated, producing a flicker at the far end, near the stairwell, near Elena's parking spot, that pulsed with the irregular rhythm of a weakening heartbeat. Elena entered the garage at 11:18, after the last customer had left, after she had wiped her tables and rolled her silverware and said goodnight to Marco, who had watched her leave with the expression of a man watching someone walk toward a ledge. Her footsteps echoed in the concrete space, a sharp, percussive report that bounced off the low ceiling and returned to her ears with a half-second delay, creating the auditory illusion of someone walking behind her. She was 30 feet from her car, a 12-year-old Honda Civic with a dent in the rear quarter panel and a windshield crack that she had been meaning to repair for 4 months, when the echo changed. It was subtle, a fraction of a second's deviation in the pattern, the kind of change that most people would process subconsciously and dismiss. Elena did not dismiss it. She had spent 3 years in federal law enforcement environments where the ability to detect changes in ambient sound patterns was not a skill, but a survival requirement, and her body responded before her mind had finished its analysis. Her stride shortened, Her weight shifted to the balls of her feet, and her hands, which had been carrying her jacket over one arm, moved to her sides, free and ready. They emerged from between a concrete pillar and a van with an out-of-state plate. 2 men. They were not Dominic Ferraro's men. This was immediately apparent, not from their appearance, which was generic enough to belong to any organization or none, but from their energy. Ferraro's men moved with the disciplined economy of professionals executing a protocol. These men moved with the loose, predatory confidence of people who enjoyed this part of their job, who found pleasure in the moment before confrontation, in the power differential between those who know what is about to happen and those who do not. The taller one spoke first. "Elena Morrow," he said, and the way he said her name, full name, both syllables weighted equally, as though reading from a file, told her everything she needed to know about who had sent them and why. "You have been very quiet for a very long time." His voice was pleasant, conversational, the voice of a man discussing the weather or a restaurant recommendation. That is appreciated. It would be unfortunate if that changed. The shorter one did not speak. He stood slightly behind and to the right of his partner, positioned in a configuration that Elena recognized from her prosecution days as a standard 2-man intimidation formation. 1 talker, 1 watcher, the talker engaging attention while the watcher assessed threat response and controlled the exit route. She stood still. She did not step back, which would have signaled retreat and invited pursuit. She did not step forward, which would have signaled aggression and potentially escalated beyond the intended scope of the encounter. She occupied her ground with the same immovable composure with which she had held Dominic Ferraro's gaze, and she spoke. "You work for Ethon," she said. It was not a question. The taller man's smile did not change, but something behind it did. A microscopic recalibration. The smile of a man whose script has been disrupted by an unscripted line. "We work for people who value discretion," he said. "People who have invested considerable resources in ensuring that certain matters remain resolved." "Resolved is a generous word for what was done to my father," Elena said, and her voice was level, and her hands were still, and the only indication that she was experiencing anything beyond clinical assessment was a single vein that had become visible at her left temple, pulsing with a rhythm that was faster than her breathing suggested. The taller man took a half-step closer. The sound of his shoe on the concrete was a small, hard sound, like a period at the end of a sentence. "Your father made choices," he said. "You made choices. The consequences of those choices have been proportional, and, I think, educational. There is no reason for anyone to revisit a curriculum that has already been completed." The fluorescent light at the far end of the garage flickered and died. In the half-second of deeper shadow that followed, Elena saw the watcher shift his weight, a preparatory movement, the same kind of shift she had seen in Ferraro's guard the night she returned the envelope, but with a different quality. Ferraro's man had shifted with defensive intent, moving toward readiness. This man shifted with anticipatory intent, moving toward action. Then the light came back, buzzing louder now, and everything happened in a sequence that lasted no more than 4 seconds, but that Elena would later remember in the elongated frame-by-frame clarity of a car accident or a fall. The watcher moved first. His hand came up from his side, not toward a weapon, but toward her arm, a grab, a restraint, a physical punctuation mark intended to underscore his partner's verbal message. He was fast. Elena was faster, not because she was stronger or more athletic, but because she had read his intention before he committed to it, the way a prosecutor reads a witness's lie before the words are fully formed. She stepped sideways, a lateral movement of perhaps 8 inches that placed her body outside his reach, and simultaneously positioned the concrete pillar between herself and his partner. The watcher's hand closed on empty air. He recalibrated. He stepped forward again, and then a voice spoke from behind them, and the voice was quiet, and the voice was calm, and the voice carried an authority so absolute that both men stopped moving with the involuntary obedience of organisms responding to a stimulus that bypassed cognition entirely and spoke directly to the brainstem, to the ancient pre-verbal part of the brain that understood hierarchy the way it understood gravity. That is enough. Dominic Ferraro stepped out of the shadow between two parked cars. He had not been there a moment ago, or perhaps he had, and Elena simply had not seen him, which was itself a kind of power, the ability to exist in a space without being detected until the precise moment detection served his purpose. He was not alone. The man in the blue suit stood 3 paces behind him, and behind the blue suit, 2 more men materialized from positions Elena could not identify, their movements converging with the fluid, unhurried precision of water filling a mold. The 2 Ethon men turned. The taller one's pleasant smile was gone, replaced by an expression that was trying very hard to remain composed and failing. The muscles of his face engaged in a civil war between professional calm and the animal recognition of a threat that outclassed him by several orders of magnitude. "Mr. Ferraro," the taller man said, and the name came out of his mouth slightly wrong, slightly too fast, the verbal equivalent of a stumble on flat ground. "This is not your concern." Dominic did not respond to this. He looked at Elena. In the flickering fluorescent light, his face was a study in controlled surfaces. No anger, no urgency, no readable emotion beyond a stillness so profound, it seemed to generate its own gravity. He looked at her for 2 seconds. He saw her standing, uninjured, her posture still composed, her hands still at her sides, her breathing still steady. He saw that she had not screamed, had not run, had not collapsed. He saw her, and in that seeing was a recognition she could feel physically, like a hand placed flat against her sternum. Then he looked at the 2 men. His eyes moved from one to the other with the unhurried deliberation of a man reading a document he already knows the contents of. "You are standing," he said in a garage beneath a restaurant where I ate dinner. The simplicity of the statement was its power. He did not threaten. He did not raise his voice. He described a fact, their location, his territory, and the implication unfolded from that fact, the way a flower unfolds from a seed, naturally, inevitably, with a beauty that was inseparable from its danger. The 2 men left. They did not run, but they wanted to. Elena could see it in their gait, the slightly too long strides, the rigid spines, the way they did not look back. They walked to a gray sedan parked near the entrance ramp and drove away with the careful, law-abiding precision of men who understood that the next 30 seconds of their lives depended on not drawing any further attention. The garage was silent. The fluorescent light flickered its arrhythmic pulse. Elena stood beside the concrete pillar and looked at Dominic Ferraro, and for the first time since she had walked into La Fontana 8 months ago with no resume and no explanation, she felt the architecture of her composure not crack, but shift, a tectonic adjustment, a redistribution of weight across structures that had been bearing too much load for too long. She did not speak first. Neither did he. The silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of 2 people who understood that words once spoken create obligations, and that obligations once created cannot be uncreated, and that the moment before speech is therefore the last moment of freedom. He spoke. "You are not a waitress," he said. She almost laughed. It rose in her chest like a bubble. Not humor, exactly, but the involuntary release of pressure that comes when someone states a truth you have been carrying alone for so long that you had forgotten it was unusual. "I am a waitress," she said. "Waitress. It is what I do. It is not what you are." She did not respond to this. The distinction he was drawing, between doing and being, between the uniform and the person inside it, was a distinction she had spent 8 months trying to erase. He waited. He was, she realized, extraordinarily good at waiting. It was a skill she recognized because she possessed it herself, the ability to occupy silence without filling it, to let the absence of words do the work that words could not. "Come with me," he said. "Not upstairs. Not to the restaurant. I have a car. We can talk." She should have said no. Every instinct she had cultivated in the past 2 years, every wall she had built, every boundary she had drawn, every careful reduction of her life to its smallest, safest dimensions, told her to say no. She said yes. Not because she trusted him. Not because she was grateful, or afraid, or calculating an advantage. She said yes because she was tired. Tired of the box in the closet. Tired of the military corners on the single bed. Tired of knowing what she knew and carrying it alone in a body that was running out of room for the weight. The car was the same Escalade from the first night, and the interior smelled of leather and something else. A cologne that was not sweet, but was rich, layered with a base note of cedar that reminded her of libraries. The driver did not acknowledge her entry. He simply drove, piloting the vehicle through the city's late-night streets with the silent competence of a man who understood that his role was transportation, and his skill was invisibility. Dominic sat beside her. The distance between them on the back seat was precisely maintained, close enough for conversation, far enough for autonomy. He did not ask where she wanted to go. He did not ask if she was all right. He asked the only question that mattered. Who were they? He said. Elena looked out the window. The city scrolled past, streetlights, storefronts, the occasional figure hunched against the cold, the endless, indifferent circulation of a world that did not notice or care that somewhere in its machinery a small injustice had been committed, and then a larger one, and then a larger one still, until the injustices accumulated into a weight that crushed a man named Robert Morrow and buried his daughter alive. She told him about her father, about the pharmacy with his name on the awning, about the pills that were not what they claimed to be, and the patients who suffered because of it, and the letters her father wrote that were never answered, and the investigation that was opened and then closed, and the case that was filed and then destroyed, and the career that was built and then demolished, and the life that was compressed from a house to an apartment, to a room, to a box in a closet that she could not bring herself to open. She told him without self-pity, without tears, without the narrative embellishments that people use to make their suffering more palatable or more dramatic. She told him the way she had once presented evidence to a federal court, clearly, precisely, with every fact verified and every claim supported. And when she was finished, the car was parked. She did not know where. Somewhere high above the city, a overlook perhaps, or a private road, because through the window she could see the skyline spread below them like a circuit board, millions of lights performing millions of functions for millions of people who trusted that the systems governing their lives were honest. Dominic was quiet for a long time. The engine ticked as it cooled. The driver's silhouette was motionless behind the partition. Then he spoke, and his voice was different, not softer, because softness was not in his register, but stripped of something, stripped of the assessment, the calculation, the constant tactical evaluation that she had felt behind every word he had spoken until now. My mother, he said, was a waitress. 41 years. The same restaurant. She never made more than she needed. She never took more than she earned. She believed that honest work was honest work, regardless of what the work was, and she raised me to understand that the value of a person has nothing to do with the size of their paycheck, and everything to do with whether they can look at themselves in a mirror at the end of the day without flinching. He paused. She died 3 years ago. I have met 10,000 people since then. Every one of them wanted something from me. You are the first person to hand something back. The offer came without preamble, without ceremony, without the performative generosity that Elena had learned to recognize as the disguise powerful people wear when they want to feel good about exercising control. Dominic spoke the way he did everything, directly, efficiently, with an economy that wasted nothing and assumed nothing. I have lawyers, he said. Not the kind your father tried to fight with, not ambulance chasers or state bar advocates. The kind that make pharmaceutical companies lose sleep. The kind that know how to reopen a case that someone spent a great deal of money to close. I have investigators. I have resources. What I do not have is the evidence, the expertise, or the standing to bring a case like yours. You have all three. He let the statement settle. Elena stared at the skyline. The lights below blurred slightly, and she blinked, and they sharpened again, and she realized that for the first time in 2 years, the blurring had not been caused by exhaustion. "I am not offering you charity," he said, and the word charity landed between them with the weight of something he found personally distasteful. "I am offering you what you need to finish what you started, what your father started." She turned to look at him. In the dim interior of the car, his face was half in shadow, half in the reflected glow of the city below, and for a moment he did not look like a man who commanded an empire built in shadow. He looked like a son whose mother had been a waitress. "If I do this," she said, "I do it my way. By the law, through the courts. No shortcuts, no intimidation, no leverage from your world applied to mine. The evidence speaks, or it does not speak, and the outcome is the outcome." He studied her. The assessment was back in his eyes, but it was different now. Not the evaluation of a stranger, but the appraisal of someone he had decided to invest in. The cold, precise calculation of a man who was about to commit resources to a venture and wanted to be certain. Not that it would succeed, but that the person leading it was incapable of being bought, broken, or bent. "Agreed," he said. There was no handshake. There was no contract. There was only the word, spoken in the back of a black SUV, parked above a sleeping city, between a man whose power operated outside the law and a woman whose power depended on it. She had one more condition. "I do not owe you anything," she said. He turned his head toward the window. The ghost of that smile, the one she had seen in the restaurant when she returned the envelope, the extinct species smile, appeared and disappeared like a flash of heat lightning on the horizon. "You owed me nothing from the moment you handed back that envelope," he said. "That is why I am here." 14 months later, the courtroom smelled of wood polish and paper and the faintly electric scent of fluorescent lights that had been burning since 7 in the morning, when the first spectators arrived to claim their seats in what the press had taken to calling the Ethon trial, but which Elena, in the privacy of her own mind, still called by its original name, the case her father built. She sat at the plaintiff's table in a dark suit that was not expensive but was precise, cut to communicate competence rather than wealth, authority rather than ambition. Her hair was pulled back. Her hands were folded on the table before her, and on her left wrist, beneath the cuff of her jacket, she wore a watch. It was a man's watch, too large for her wrist, its face scratched, its leather band softened by decades of wear. It had belonged to Robert Morrow. She had taken it from the box in the closet 14 months ago, on the night she decided to stop hiding, and she had worn it every day since, not as a talisman or a good luck charm, but as a weight. A reminder. A calibration device, like the metronome of her morning runs, keeping her aligned with a rhythm that had been set long before she was born. The rhythm of a man who believed that truth, delivered with precision and patience, was stronger than any force designed to suppress it. The trial had lasted 9 weeks. The evidence she presented was the evidence her father had compiled, supplemented by 2 years of investigation, conducted by a team of lawyers and forensic accountants, whose fees were paid by a source that the court did not ask about and that Elena did not volunteer. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. When the foreman stood to read the verdict, Elena did not close her eyes. She did not hold her breath. She watched with the same steady, unblinking attention she had brought to every moment of the past 14 months, the attention of a woman who had learned that the act of witnessing, the simple refusal to look away, was itself a form of power. Guilty. On all counts, the word moved through the courtroom like a wave through water, a physical displacement, a rearrangement of pressure. In the gallery, reporters typed. Spectators murmured. The Ethon executives at the defense table sat in a stillness that was not composed but stunned. The stillness of men who had believed so completely in the impenetrability of their defenses that the breach, when it came, did not register as defeat but as impossibility. Elena stood. She gathered her files. She placed them in the same banker's box that had sat on the shelf in her closet for 2 years. The box that had held her father's evidence, her father's fight, her father's life. It was lighter now, not because anything had been removed, but because the weight it carried had been transferred. distributed across the public record, the court transcripts, the verdict, the law. It was no longer hers alone. Outside the courthouse, the April air was warm and carried the green mineral scent of a city emerging from winter. Elena walked down the stone steps with the box under her arm, and she did not hurry, and she did not pause for the reporters who called her name, and she did not look toward the street where a single black SUV was parked at the curb, its engine idling, its darkened windows reflecting the courthouse facade like obsidian mirrors. She walked to her car. It was not the 12-year-old Honda Civic. It was a modest sedan she had purchased 3 months ago with money she had earned, not from Dominic Ferraro, but from the consulting work she had begun doing for a nonprofit pharmaceutical watchdog that had approached her after the trial's opening arguments made national news. She opened the driver's door and stopped. On the passenger seat was a bottle of wine, a Barolo, the 2012. Beside it, a card. She picked up the card. It was small, cream-colored, heavy stock, the kind of card that does not come from a store, but from a stationer who has been making the same product for generations. On it, in handwriting that was precise and unhurried and controlled, a single word, Honore. She did not need to translate it. She understood. She set the card on the dashboard, placed the banker's box on the back seat, and sat behind the wheel for a moment, her hands resting on the leather, her father's watch ticking softly against her wrist. Through the windshield the city moved and breathed and continued, indifferent and immense, and somewhere within it, a man in a dark suit sat in the back of a black SUV and did not watch her leave, because watching would have implied concern, and concern would have implied a debt, and there was no debt between them. There was only the recognition, quiet, mutual, permanent, that some refusals are not rejections. They are introductions. The most honest thing one person can say to another is no. It is the only word that cannot be purchased, and the only people worth knowing are the ones who understand its value.